off with Mr. Sørbø, who was in Sudan during the elections. And we hope that you will tell us a little bit what was happening prior to the elections, what are your views on the actual elections and the situation after.
Thank you, and I will be brief. Just a bit of background first. As most of you know a so-called comprehensive peace agreement was signed between the government in Khartoum and the Sudan People's Liberation Army and movement in January 2005. And this agreement stipulated an interim period of 6 years, at the end of which there is supposed to be, and there will be, a referendum regarding the future status of Southern Sudan, whether or not Southern Sudan will still be part of Sudan or an independent nation. And elections were to be held after 3 years as part of this interim period, as part of the agreement. That means the elections were supposed to have been held in 2008, but were postponed by 1 year. And the international community, so-called, primarily Norway, the UK and the US, were pushing to have elections as part of the agreement for 2 reasons, I believe. First of all, they wanted to make the agreement more inclusive. It was an exclusive agreement between the government and one rebel movement, and there were other parties in the country which were excluded from this agreement, and by having multi-party elections it was believed that you would get a more inclusive process. And secondly, there was the thinking that an elected government should preside over the referendum and not a government that came to power in a military coup. As it happened, and as you know, the National Congress Party and the SPLM, the signatories of the agreement, won the elections, and it has been largely endorsed by the international community, I would say. The most common terminology on it was that there were frequent irregularities, technical irregularities. But even as late as yesterday, there was a new report from the Carter Center talking about fraud, cases of fraud. But the international observers, primarily the European Union, the Carter Center, and the African Union and the Arab League, largely endorsed, saying that it was not up to international standards, but it was acceptable. We can go into details if anybody wants to follow that up. And I think that is largely true in the sense that the rigging and the manipulation mostly took place before the elections. It started with the census taking. The report from Darfur, for example, has seen that there are suddenly an enormous number of Arab nomads in Darfur. And the voter registrations, we have private observations from Abu Dhafar on how this was done. And so on. So to the extent that there was rigging and manipulation, most of that was done before. And we are not just talking about the NCP in the north, we are also talking about the SPLM in the south. In addition, of course, the NCP used the resources of the state, and the SPLM used the resources of the state to prepare for the elections. And it was an easy run to the extent that the opposition parties were weak, disorganized, had few resources. And it was very clear also, if you visited polling stations, that there was always a tent of the NCP in the legal distance from the polling station, but very, very few tents and very few structures by the other parties. And they were busing and transporting people to the polling stations, whereas other parties did not have the same apparatus, the same means, but maybe also the same kind of organization. The international community pushed for the elections to be held now in April, because it was stipulated to take place, as I said, according to the peace agreement, and thereby maybe one could say, sacrificing the interests and perhaps even the future of the people like my colleague and friend Abdel Ghaffar, the opposition in northern Sudan, because the elections gave a mandate to the National Congress Party, which had come to power through a legitimate coup. And why did the international community push so much for the elections? Because the alternatives were seen to be much worse. And the alternatives were seen to be renewed war, and that this would have been a threat, seen from the southern point of view, against the referendum being postponed or not held at all. So that was probably the main reason why this was also pushed. We could use the term realpolitik in that sense. So we ended up supporting elections where the dominant parties and the dominant party in the north put up as presidential candidate a criminalized president, whom we will arrest if he lands on our soil, thereby again revealing the inconsistencies of the international engagement in the Sudan, which has been there all the time in many different areas, but again we saw that in the during these elections. Whether or not the elections were wasted efforts is debatable. Many of the observers from outside said that they were not a wasted effort. They did not, definitely not make Sudan a democracy, but they did increase democratic space. They did provide perhaps a trial for the referendum for future elections. And perhaps also they were better organized and freer and fairer than what we have seen in countries like Nigeria, and perhaps even the upcoming elections in Ethiopia, Rwanda, and Egypt, just to take a few examples. So that is debatable, but it wasn't experienced. It was rigged, manipulated, but pushed by the international community. And what is remaining is a host of issues that have to be addressed before referendum.